Scripture for the message is James 4, verses 11 through 17. Do not speak evil against one another, brothers. The one who speaks against a brother or judges his brother speaks evil against the law and judges the law. If you judge the law, you're not a doer of the law, but a judge. There's only one lawgiver and judge, he who is able to save and destroy. Who are you to judge your neighbor? Come now, you who say, today or tomorrow we'll go into such and such a town, spend a year there and trade and make a profit. Yet you do not know what tomorrow will bring. What is your life? You're a mist that appears for a little time and then vanishes. Instead, you ought to say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. As it is, you boast in your arrogance, and all such boasting is evil. So whoever knows the right thing to do and fails to do it, for him it is sin. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Do you think of yourself as an arrogant person? I think all of us would say no, or I certainly hope not. And yet, all throughout church history, Jesus' followers have spoken about two kinds of arrogance or pride. One is that very visible form that we quickly say no to, where someone, you can tell even by the way they carry themselves, they strut around and they act like they're better than everybody else, and you'd say, oh, there's an arrogant or prideful person. That's the more visible one. The other form is more subtle. Sometimes in church history it's been called spiritual pride because it's a temptation unique to Christians, and it's largely hidden from view. Now, how do we know if we have this hidden kind of arrogance or pride? Well, it shows itself in two ways. Whenever we think we're right in judging someone else around us, that's a sign that, yes, indeed, there's a hidden arrogance there. The second way it shows itself is when we think that we direct our own path. When we think we're in charge of our own life completely, that everything is just up to us. That also betrays a hidden form of arrogance. And God graciously moves us away from that kind of hidden pride and leads us towards a spiritual humility. That's what our text is lifting up for us. As James asks, first of all, how can we speak against one another? Because if you speak against or judge one another, you're actually judging God's law. And I think he has in mind, he's not saying it specifically here, but he mentioned earlier, the summation of God's law was love your neighbor as yourself. And so that's what God calls us to do. But he says, if you judge that law, you're not a doer of the law, you're not a law-abiding person in God's eyes, but you're a judge. And yet he kind of reminds us as if he's looking up and he says, there's one judge. There's one lawgiver. You know, we aren't that. He who is able to save and to destroy. It's almost as if James is saying, can we do that? Can we save other people's souls or destroy them? No, then we also can't make God's law. And we can't change God's law arbitrarily because someone has done something to hurt us. Now, if another Christian comes up to us to be helpful and says, you know, I think you're starting to feel a little bitter and judgmental about this other person, we feel real comfortable in just saying, yeah, but did you see what they did to me? You know, I've got a right to be mad and to judge them. But James would have remind us that we're always in the Lord's presence. As if we're there, can we imagine ourselves when the Lord's asking us about our bitterness in our heart, and to say, yeah, but did you see what they did to us? And it's like, well, of course he saw what everybody has done. But that same God also reminds us, well, didn't I say in my law to love that person? not to judge that person. So James asks us, who are you to judge your neighbor? So that's one form of hidden pride or arrogance. And now James addresses the second form. Come now, you who say today or tomorrow I'll go into such and such a town, I'll spend a year there and I'll trade and make a profit. Now the world considers that normal planning. It's just something you're supposed to do, and it would be foolish not to do it in the world's eyes. But Jesus' disciples should not think that way, James said. Tomorrow is not in our hands. We cannot control tomorrow, and we don't want to plan as if we could control it. He says, what is your life? You're a mist, which appears for a while and then vanishes. We think sometimes in the morning mist or fog we'll see out here, and then it goes away when the sun shines. He's saying that spiritually, that's what our life is like, and yet here we are thinking we can control all our surroundings and control everything about tomorrow. A disciple of Jesus instead, he says, should say, if the Lord wills. And that's the important phrase. If the Lord wills, we will live and we'll do this or that. So again, it's a matter of place there for us, and knowing our place. We're not the Lord of life. Jesus is. And so that's why if the Lord wills isn't just words to add to the front of everything we say. It's supposed to be what's in our heart. So to think we direct our future is to boast in our arrogance, James says, and all such boasting is evil. So in both cases, the hidden pride is exposed. Trying to change God's law so that I can judge and be mad at someone who's done something to me, or on the other hand, to think that we're in control of our own life. Disciples of Jesus are never supposed to think of themselves as arrogant, yet they can still have a hidden form of arrogance in their hearts. And in fact, that's a temptation that only Jesus can deliver us from. Let's hear how Hazel Zieman was tempted in this way. She said for 6 years, her next-door neighbor, Barbara, was a very close friend of hers, and they would do all sorts of things together. But all that changed on the day of an auction sale. Her distant cousins were moving out of state, and it was Hazel who invited Barbara. She's letting several of her lovely pieces go. One of them is a bureau of solid walnut, over 100 years old. You must go with me to the sale. Always trying to get me interested in antiques, Barbara laughed. Okay, I'll go with you. Hazel even urged her, well, don't just go, be ready to buy something this time for a change. Go ahead and get something. It was Hazel's great-great-uncle, Ned, who had built the bureau, carving the handles so that they looked like oak leaves, very intricate. And in fact, the bureau had come over in a covered wagon all the way across the country. They lived out in California. Hazel had always admired the bureau, but she never in her wildest dreams thought she would have a chance to be able to own it. So they arrived at the sale early that day, and her cousin was on the phone, so she couldn't say, I want this bureau. So the cousin's husband took her around and was showing her old pieces of silver and other things that they were going to sell. And that's when Barbara walked up and she said, well, I did. I bought something. Good, show me. Barbara took her over, pointed to the bureau. Not my bureau, she said. I must have shouted, for Barbara backed off, looking shocked and hurt. Your bureau? I thought that's what you wanted me to buy. I must have gone temporarily insane, Hazel said, for I said some awful things to Barbara. How she knew that I wanted that bureau more than anything else in the world, and how I thought she was my friend, and how I hated her for doing this to me. Barbara ran out of the house, and Hazel said to this day she still doesn't know how she got home from there at the time. Hazel said, I felt sick inside. Several times in the next few days I started to go and apologize. When I finally got up the nerve, Barbara saw me from out in the yard and ran into her house. They went weeks without talking. They had an unexpected meeting where they come around the corner in a supermarket and bump into each other, said both stammered a hello, and then left. And Hazel thought, this is ridiculous. I got us into this mess, and I'm going to get us out. So she went over to Barbara's house and rang the doorbell. When she answered, she said, this whole thing is silly. I've known that for a long time, Barbara answered. But her voice was icy, and she didn't smile at all. Helen choked up and she laughed. How could she make this so hard for me? There was a PTA meeting, and both her and Barbara got appointed to a certain planning committee, but when they showed up for the first meeting, Barbara wasn't there. Hazel asked the chairperson and said, well, she said that she couldn't possibly serve, something about personal reasons. Well, that's certainly a slap in the face, Hazel thought to herself. A strange ugliness settled inside me, she said. It squeezed my throat muscles, and the pressure gave me a headache. Her cousin called her and said that Barbara didn't want the bureau and when would she like to come and pick it up. But now she didn't want to see the bureau ever again. She hated it. And that morning she was doing her morning devotions, and it was a section out of Ephesians 4. It said, accept life with humility and patience, making allowances for one another because you love one another. And she thought to herself, well, haven't I tried to love Barbara with Christian love? And so she prayed this prayer at the end of the devotion. God, this is such a little thing, but it got so terribly big inside me. All I can feel for Barbara is resentment. I tried to love her, it just doesn't seem to work. But you, Lord, have enough love. Please share it with me. And she said immediately after that, she felt this great sense of relief. She thought everything was better as she went about the day with her family and felt good. But the next day, there was another devotion still from Ephesians 4. If you are angry, be sure it is not out of wounded pride or a bad temper. Then it dawned on Hazel. No wonder I hadn't been able to feel Christian love. All this time I've been blaming Barbara for refusing to do her part. It began to be clear to me that if God's love was going to show through me, it needed some sort of action on my part. And so several times that week, if she saw Barbara out in the backyard, she would call hello over to her, trying to sound as nice and as possible and praying inwardly as she said it. And no answer at first, but by the end of the week, Barbara started to say hello back. There was an open house coming up at school, and so she went next door and rang the doorbell. Barbara, I'm going down to open house tonight. Won't you ride with me? Barbara hesitated, and inwardly Hazel was praying, Lord bless you, Barbara, the Lord bless you. And she kept trying to say that inwardly, and outwardly she said, I'd really like to have you. And suddenly Barbara smiled and said, all right. Eventually their relationship was able to mend from that one day. Hazel memorized those verses from Ephesians 4. They taught me that what I can do is pretty limited, but what God can do through me is something else again. None of us wants to be considered arrogant, and yet arrogance can hide within our hearts. If we think it's okay to judge someone else whom God told us to love, if we think we're in charge of our own lives completely, we're being tempted by a spiritual arrogance. May the Lord Jesus deliver us from this. Only He is stronger than our judgments. Only He is the true Lord of our whole lives. So